everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today, I'm delighted to be speaking with Don Vinson and Victoria Huckle. Guys, welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
Thanks, Dan. Great to be here.
Thank you.
Great to have you both on. Really excited to be speaking to you today. Why don't we start by getting you to introduce yourselves to the Sports Psych Show audience. Don, do you want to go first?
Great. Thanks, Dan. Yeah. So I'm Don Vinson. I'm a principal lecturer at the University of Worcester, and my subject is sports coaching. And in particular, I'm passionate about athlete and coach learning and coach development. And another bit that's really important to me is my work as a coach and as a coach developer with England Hockey, and I work within the talent development program there.
So a bit of a pracademic.
Oh, I hate that term, but yes, okay.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. I'm happy that other people can use that badge if they wish to have it.
Fair enough. Off to a flying start here, Don. It's all about establishing positive relationships at the beginning, just from the outset. And so, Victoria, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah. So, hi, I'm Victoria. I'm also maybe a pracademic, if you like to call it that. I am a PhD student at the University of Worcester, and Don is my Director of Studies. Also, I'm very interested in the landscapes of practice approach, specifically currently amongst rowing coaches through my PhD. And I am a rowing coach alongside doing my PhD in girls junior high performance rowing.
And do you hate the term pracademic as much as Don does?
I don't really like it. But I knew he'd love it if I said that. So.
Well, thank you both so much for not hanging up straight away. That would have been the world's shortest show. Just a couple of introductions, and that was it. It would have been, the audience would have lapped that one up. In amongst that great introduction, Victoria, you mentioned this term, landscapes of practice, and hey, look, that's what we're going to be talking about today. In fact, we're going to be going through a paper that you both co-wrote along with a colleague, Andy Cale. The title of that paper is I've Had a Magical Journey, Understanding How International Sports Coaches Learn Through Cross-Sport Boundary Encounters. So we're really going to try and bring this paper alive and take some key points and some learnings for coaches who might want to engage in this notion of landscapes of practice. And you know, beginning at the beginning, I mean, Victoria, tell me about your interest in landscapes of practice. I suppose let's start with the social learning environment. The way you start this paper is you kind of introduce this notion that coach development, and we're talking about coach development here, is less about technical development and less about direct instruction these days. Over the past 20 years, it's become much more about social interaction, about collaboration. Talk to me a bit about that emerging theme of collaboration and social interaction.
Yeah, I think that my initial interest in landscapes of practice came from my own kind of work as a coach. I was doing some study alongside it, but was very much kind of on the coaching pathway and wanting to be the best coach I could be. And my engagement in the academic side was maybe less so. And I think I came across, while I was doing my master's, really courtesy of Don, came across this social learning theory that Etienne Wenger kind of has developed, and it was this idea of a landscape of practice that kind of it really engaged me because I was meeting so many coaches on my journey that were engaging with formal education but weren't necessarily loving it or putting it at the this is how I learn tree, and they were learning in so many different ways and interacting with so many different things as part of their journey, really, that didn't really fit in any specific model. And when I kind of came across and read this landscapes of practice stuff, it kind of brought that to life. And I guess that's where my interest initially came from in the subject. It's like, how are these coaches learning maybe outside of those formal kind of learning environments, and how are they, and how is that shaping their kind of identity as a coach, kind of moving through their pathway. So I think that's kind of how I initially became interested in the topic.
Really interesting, and Don, I remember as a professional golfer coaching after I'd played, and I started coaching. One of the reasons why, after finishing my masters, my sports psychology masters, one of the reasons why I picked sports psychology to specialize in, to become a registered sports psychologist, was because I was really keen to develop. I suppose stay a little bit in education and broaden my qualifications or build my qualifications. And I felt at the time that coaching wouldn't necessarily allow me to do that. Maybe that was a bit of naivety on my part. But certainly nowadays, it seems like every single coach, or a lot of coaches, are now engaging in qualifications, postgraduate qualifications, further education. Kind of what I'm hearing from Victoria, and maybe counting what I've said, is that perhaps some of those coaches are finding their engagement in their qualifications slightly limiting. Historically, perhaps they've liked to learn from different sources in a social manner, in a collaborative manner. And this traditional form of education doesn't necessarily suit them. They want a little bit of both, perhaps.
I think that the history of coach education and qualification is probably quite interesting. If we were to go back not too many years, there wouldn't be such thing as qualifications or formal coach education. We'd have to dial the clock back too many years to that. And so people in coaching and who have been expert coaches over the years have probably learnt in all kinds of different ways and in many different forms forever, really. But then just as formal coach education emerged, it probably began in quite a basic sense, as it were. It was very much about certification to make sure that coaches were safe in their practice, and so it was quite a basic competency-led thing, and therefore it was only ever, I suppose, going to, in those early days, hit a small proportion, both of the market in terms of coaches, but also in terms of the extent to which it could help coaches to develop and learn to be experts. So it was probably never going to do that. I think, though, as coaching has developed and it has become undoubtedly more professional, whatever you might make of that term, there is absolutely investment in further study, more qualifications, absolutely. But I think the nature of those qualifications, both in institutes of higher education and with national governing bodies in these last 10 years or so, has radically shifted. And it's shifted away from this very technocratic understanding that we are going to deliver a very sort of cut and paste curriculum, if you like, that's the same for everybody. And that's the argument that we make at the beginning of the paper, that we've started to understand that coach education needs to be different, and the way that coach learning needs to get away from that rather simplistic, rather universal cut and paste approach to how coaches learn, and therefore it needs to be much more bespoke, individualized. It therefore needs to be much more socially engaging in terms of discussion and collaboration between people.
And having an underpinning framework or theory can be quite useful. And this is where Etienne Wenger Trainer's social learning theory comes in. It provides a useful framework to better understand coach learning in this manner. Victoria, can you briefly take us through Wenger Trainer's social learning theory?
Yeah, so I guess the Etienne Wenger kind of started his theory very much in terms of kind of the second phase, I guess, of the theory was the term community of practice, which I guess lots of people within sport and within coaching will have heard of. And what we really like about Etienne's theory is that over the past 30 years it's evolved, but it always kind of builds and builds and builds on things that he's done moving forward. So I like it because it's so applicable, and I really feel I can kind of apply it across my role as a coach, but also within my PhD as well. So we start with this term community of practice and how coaches learn within that community, which I'm sure that a lot of coaches have identified with kind of in some shape or form. But then what we're really interested through this paper is the landscapes of practice, where coaches kind of look outside that community, and they interact at what we term here boundaries. So they're interacting with people maybe outside of their initial community, and it could be across sport, across life, kind of within their whole kind of learning landscape. And it's how they learn through those interactions and how they're aligning. So Wenger uses the term alignment a lot, and how they're aligning with these different people, and they're developing their identity, and they're developing their competence through that journey. And it's specifically that part of the theory that we talk about in this paper, and coaches' experiences of boundaries there. And Etienne and Beverly, Wenger trainer, have moved the theory on. So there's a more recent text where they start to talk about social learning spaces rather than a community of practice. So that's again kind of moving that idea on again, and kind of moving away a little bit from the term community of practice, and really understanding these coaches' social learning journey as part of a bigger picture. So that's how things are moving forwards from there. But specifically within this paper, the landscape and specifically the boundaries are the part of that journey that we are really looking at.
Seriously dynamic and evolving. And as you've mentioned, Victoria, this paper is about the landscapes of practice. I do, if it's okay, want to dwell a little bit on that community of practice, because I think it gives the audience a good idea of what this looks like. Don, okay, so this term community of practice, I think people can kind of figure out what that's about, but what does that specifically look like? Draw upon a simple image for us in terms of what a community of practice is.
So I think the community of practice, or its use, has been really widespread in a whole range of different disciplines, from coaching to education to nursing to it's a really universal phenomenon. And I think it's grasped people because at its center, people recognize that learning does go on with and through other people as we bounce ideas off one another, we try and figure out problems. And essentially that was, I guess, what the beginnings of the communities of practice theory was about. It was trying to explain how people, if you like, made a transition from being an outsider on a community at the periphery through to its center. In sort of theoretical terms, that was the journey from being a newcomer to becoming an old timer. So, for example, a community of practice could be a group of sports coaches who are working perhaps in an academy, in a football club or a rugby club, whatever it might be. And if that group are bound by these terms, there are some theoretical terms, but essentially if they're in it together, they're trying to work on problems together, and they're bouncing ideas off one another and trying to solve the issues that are confronting them. And within that sort of space, there is an idea of what competent coaching is, which is, it's a socially prescribed thing. Then the group decide, essentially, either explicitly or perhaps not explicitly, what counts as quality coaching, what is competence in this environment. Well, that group essentially become that community. And what has captured us about that, and I think what captures so many people, is that people recognized, well, that often is where learning takes place. And for years, people have talked about learning through experience, learning through other people and mentors. And so the term community of practice, I think, is one way or one step in the journey of understanding something about that process a little more profoundly.
So learning is in the in between coaches. It's sitting in a room, to put it at its most basic, it's sitting in a room with a bunch of coaches. If you're an academy coach, having a conversation around the specific challenges that you face, short term, medium term, long term. Would that be a fair sort of little summary there?
Yes, in part. Knowing that I guess we focus there on practice, particularly. It's we're going to learn how to be a better coach here. We're going to pick up some skills that are going to help us to develop our athletes, and we can only do that with the help of other people and bouncing ideas, etc. But fundamentally, this theory is more than that. It's saying, well, learning your skills and behaviors and the practices of coaching is one thing, but actually learning is so much deeper than that. It's about learning where you belong. And it's also about learning where you are accepted. And perhaps even more than that, the most importantly, and sort of Etienne and Bev would say, sort of the ultimate, it's about learning out what really matters and who you are, and what and what is valuable in this space. So it's a theory of becoming, if you like, in one of those senses. It's so much more transcendent than just the nuts and the bolts of coaching.
So would I be right in saying that there's a psychosocial element to this then? That there's, my confidence level is going to interact with my position within that community, for example, Victoria. There's going to be some psychological qualities that I'm going to experience as a consequence of how I perceive my position within that community of practice.
Yeah, and I think that the coaches that we see, and all coaches, are constantly kind of aligning themselves with these behaviours. So they may meet a coach that they deem, say, more powerful than them, or that they aren't confident in conversation with, and they're constantly kind of reevaluating this becoming and where they're going, and the direction that they're going, in relation to so many things. So confidence may be one of those, but it may not specifically even be within their actual coaching practice. It's kind of their journey as an individual. And they will be constantly aligning, and that's where, again, going back to these boundaries, that's where they really specifically, coaches will kind of negotiate with others, and they'll come into contact with some individuals that they really do kind of resonate with, and they really kind of do completely kind of latch on with, and they'll come across others where they don't feel confident to engage with that, and that's something that they really don't kind of resonate with.
That's really interesting. It makes me consider that if I'm embedded within a community, and as you said there, Don, like a community could be as simple as a group of academy of coaches in one entity, an academy, a Premier League academy, let's say. My capacity to learn and my ability perhaps to progress within that community, progress my career perhaps, is mediated by not just what I learn or my ability to learn, but also those psychosocial factors. Where am I? What am I doing? Who's here? How does this make me feel? How do these events make me feel? It's that sort of complex dynamic within the community that matters to my learning, to my experiences.
And it is mediated also by the judgments that others make of you, in whether they deem you to be competent, and therefore whether they're going to allow you space to grow, or whether they're going to confine your practice and say, no, you can only look after this group. You're not yet good enough, or you're not yet competent enough in our eyes to come and coach the under 18s. You work with the under 14s until you're ready. And therefore, we see that a community of practice is not necessarily, it's not some kind of learning panacea where we say community of practice good. It isn't that. It's to say this is a way of understanding what's going on. And it might be uplifting, and it might be fulfilling for people, but it also for other people might be actually quite constraining and quite belittling. And so a community of practice is a useful framework to understand what's going on. It's not a prescription for good practice. In that sense.
Just dwelling on that, as somebody who has an interest, let's say, in the basics of personality science, when you say a community of practice can be uncomfortable for some people, and I don't know if I'm looking at this in somewhat of a simplistic manner, but if I am typically introverted, for instance, if I test, let's say, let's say I experience a degree of social anxiety, are those the kind of, let's say, personality traits, typical responses in social situations that might mediate my experience within a community of practice to either of you?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think everyone enters this community of practice, and some people would enter a community of practice really excited to engage with others and really excited to build on what they're doing, and others completely would kind of stand back from that. And I think that that's where kind of labeling a community of practice as we're a group of coaches and we are going to learn in a community of practice isn't necessarily where the best learning occurs. And that's why specifically through what I'm doing, I've kind of moved away from that community of practice, and I'm just more interested in the coach's individual journey and how they're learning, because that engagement isn't always necessarily kind of key in a coach's journey. It might, it will impact it in some way, but everybody approaches situations in different ways, and we know that, and that's where this kind of is really useful in terms of understanding where that learning is taking place.
I think some of the implications of this have been really important to us, and for me personally, this is something that's made me stand up and listen and really think there's some truth here, because as I think about social spaces where learning occurs, whether you want to call them communities of practice or not, whatever label you want to give to them, if I'm either responsible for leading those, or I'm responsible for facilitating them in any way, setting them up, or even if I'm in charge of maybe evaluating them and feeding back to the leaders of those spaces, then the understanding of how individuals engage in those situations, their disposition to those learning situations is really important. So, for example, in that academy setting, if we stick with that example, if we do have one of our coaches who's really introverted, is not the kind of one who's going to, either throw the toys out of the pram, or they're not going to really jump up in a meeting and say, "Oh, this is what I think." They're actually going to be quite. How, as a leader of that environment or as a member of that community, how do I foster that environment so that person can thrive and learn and develop, even if they might be not naturally drawn to being the life and soul of the party? You don't have to be an expert sports coach. So how do we foster that environment? How do we build that environment appropriately? How do we frame the tasks that we might ask people to do in such a way that actually we can make this, or perhaps we can help people in those environments to thrive and to grow? And that's what's captured me as something that could be really useful about looking at it from this perspective.
Landscapes of practice came out of, I believe, criticism, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, came out of criticisms around community of practice. Am I right in saying that? And if so, what were those criticisms, and how did that lead to this idea of landscape of practice?
In part, we've used that term in the paper. I don't know how Victoria feels about that now. I'm wondering, reflecting on that a bit, whether that was an appropriate term to use, because I genuinely think that Bev and Etienne Wenger trainer have been working on this. It's their life's work, essentially, this theory, and they've been building this theory for 30, 40 years. And therefore, it was always going to develop. And even when Etienne wrote the Communities of Practice book, 1999, he published that, there was some brilliant, it's a really good theoretical piece of work in the field of learning. But throughout it acknowledges that it's only a small part of the puzzle, and the next bit is going to come. So I think he always knew there was another stage coming. It might have taken the best part of 25 years to write the next stage, but it was always been in development. Yeah, so partly I think maybe as a response to criticism, there has been criticism of communities of practice, as there are all good theoretical works that have engaged the world, because people say, oh, it doesn't quite do this, or it doesn't quite do that, or it doesn't quite account for that. Well, of course it doesn't. And it's not supposed to be this. It's not supposed to explain all learning ever. It's actually it's much more targeted than that in one sense. So yeah, I think though that Etienne would say he was aware of the criticism, of course. Perhaps that might have shaped some of the things that they wrote in phase 3 and the development of landscapes. I don't know if I've represented that fairly.
I think as well, on reading the text, certainly from my perspective, when I first engaged with the text, I was very new to research in many ways. So I think I was very like, stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. I even called them the yellow book, the purple book, the white book, and kind of kept them very separate and read them as this must be a response to something else, and this must be a response. But having now met and talked to Etienne and understood this further, like as Don says, it's kind of much more of a bigger picture where everything feeds into everything, and you might look at a situation and initially I probably thought, I need to put a communities of practice label on this, or I need to say that this is a boundary, or and to an extent obviously you do, but it all kind of feeds into each other as this bigger picture, and evolves, and it's not necessarily a community into a landscape into it. It doesn't have to be staged in that way. It's kind of much more of a messy picture.
So I know, Victoria, you've already given us a little bit of an idea of this notion of landscape of practice, and this is what this research is all about. But we've talked a bit about community of practice, and that's that very much a localized group of people, if you like. What's a landscape of practice? What's the difference there?
So I guess to me, simply, if looking at an individual coach, the landscape is their journey and everything that encompasses them as an individual. So you could literally draw it like a landscape with hills and with rivers and everything that encompasses their kind of journey as an individual, as a coach, but then also kind of in their broader life. And we look at that, their journey through that landscape and kind of all the interactions they have, and how they learn kind of through that journey. And then we obviously talk a lot in the paper about these boundaries, where these coaches will interact with kind of many different people, many different communities of practice maybe, but also social learning spaces. They may not always be communities, and on these boundaries they'll sometimes agree, they'll sometimes not agree, they'll maybe unpack some of what they do and then they'll put it back together again, but they'll learn, and it's kind of the learning potential at these boundaries that I'm really interested in, and we're really interested in, and how those coaches kind of then move their development as a coach on, but more importantly their identity as an individual and how that impacts their coaching. So
take me through this research paper. What were you've kind of explained to us there what you were trying to discover, but talk to me about who was involved, how you went about this, and then we can start to talk about some of the data that you got back.
So this was a project where we were asked to review this community of practice, if you like, we'll use that term, which was a group of very good level coaches. They were coaching at sort of junior international, some at senior international, but perhaps had been identified by their national governing body as the next Olympic level coaches. So they might have been coaching at the Commonwealth Games maybe, or at under 21 level, hadn't quite yet reached Olympic level, but had that potential and had been selected on that basis. So these were really good, experienced coaches. And this was a program of development, essentially, that was put together by a national sporting organisation. And these coaches were sort of sponsored to come on this program of development over the course of 18 months. And therefore, it wasn't formal in the sense of they didn't get a certificate at the end, but it was an organised program of development. So these coaches came on the program, and there were 13, 14, I can't quite remember now, and they were given a mentor to support them through the journey, and they would come together every few months for a couple of days for sort of some designated workshops, and that community and that sort of spirit in the group was built over the course of those 18 months, from which they would, to a certain extent, engage or otherwise with the group and with the workshop content and topics.
So, Victoria, what kind of I suppose it's going to be qualitative data. What kind of things arose out of this research that was really interesting to you?
Yeah, so I think for us, the interviews were great, and I think the coaches really kind of told their story. I guess that was really interesting, that they kind of told their story through the program, but also kind of more widely in terms of their story and journey as a coach as well. And I think I kind of obviously touched on these boundary interactions earlier, but what was like kind of really interesting to us was how the participants kind of negotiated meaning at these boundaries of practice. And in the paper, we put that into four categories effectively. So in relation to their confidence, openness, authenticity, we talk about sense making, and we talk about reflection, and then reconceptualizing and reframing. But all of this is in respect to their cross-boundary interactions. So within this program, obviously, it was very cross-sport. So the interactions between the coaches in terms of interacting with other sports and with coaches from other environments was the really interesting part for us, because that was kind of boundary interactions in sport. That's kind of what that is. So what was really interesting to us was how they negotiated this meaning effectively at these boundaries, and how that impacted their identity as a coach, and the impact on their learning from the program.
You talked about four categories, four major categories.
Yeah.
The first one being confidence, openness, and authenticity. I mean, that confidence piece was quite interesting, in as much as I suppose, would I be right in saying, and I'm not 100% sure if I'm getting this right here, so please excuse me, but that there was a boundary was that there was a lack of confidence to communicate across sports. Would I be right in saying that? Or there was from time to time with some participants?
Yeah, with almost always, and with most participants, I would say. And
Okay.
and that was something that was affirming to us straight away, because we were coming in sort of knowing that we were going to explore the cross sport interactions. We were really interested in that, and straight away, as we're having these conversations, without us really setting it up, it became so apparent to us right from the start that it wasn't the content that was the first and foremost issue. It wasn't the nature of, hey, workshop 1 was about psychological resilience, and workshop 2 was about planning, for example. That wasn't the thing here. That wasn't the major deal that was going on. And the thing, say the first theme that you talk about there, the first bit of that confidence, shocked us to a certain extent. We're speaking to very highly qualified, very experienced, high-level coaches. And there's like the first quotation we put in the paper from a swimming coach who said, "Oh, do you know, I didn't feel very confident coming to this program. I felt confident in my own environment because, you know, he knew that he was a good coach, and he knew that he could deliver in his own setting, and he knew that his athletes, he could help them. But he said coming into this environment, actually, he didn't feel very confident. He felt very conflicted in many ways about his identity on this program." And almost all of the coaches we spoke to didn't quite say this, but they meant, I'm not sure what I'm doing here. I'm not sure that I'm not sure I should be here. I don't think that I'm quite good enough to be here. Or, you know, look at all these amazing people around me. Why am I here? And sometimes I think we might see learning in a really quite simplistic way where we think it's just about the material that these coaches are going to digest and take away and apply as if it's some easy input output process. But this program really reinforced to us the process of learning is not like that. You have to take account very strongly of people's disposition to the program. You have to work out, if you're a leader of this environment, how are you going to build the group, knowing that actually they're quite unsettled. They're not really confident that they think that they or know that they should be here. They're not quite sure what to make of the other people, or in fact what the other people are making of them. So you've got to build the group, and you've got to bond the group, and you've got to grow that dynamic to such an extent that they feel they can open up. And one of the coaches, Silas, who we report this in through the paper, said it wasn't until the third weekend when we got together. This is like now 6 months into the program, where he said that was the stage we did this life script exercise where actually people really opened up and actually bared their soul to each other to a certain extent. And his inference was that up to that point, we were just going through the motions, or we were just playing at the edges of what this could really be. And it wasn't until we got that. And then he said, from there, it was like magic. It was like coming through the door, and everybody, the dynamic had changed, the group had changed. And that really reinforced to us actually that we're, that this framework of considering what is happening then at these boundaries, if you like, as these different coaches come together and explore the differences and the similarities in their practice. If we can understand that and we can help to perhaps broker that in some way, then we've got a much better chance of really meaningfully helping them to grow and develop.
I know what you were trying, what you've just said there, Don, that's what you were trying to investigate is how do we help these people come together? How do we give them let's say a safe space to open up? But as you were speaking there, it made me think of how coaches, the confidence that coaches experience or have, can be so driven by domain-specific knowledge rather than a personal confidence. In as much as I'm a coach of, I'm a skiing coach, and I think one of them was, I might be wrong, but I'm a skiing coach. I have so much domain-specific knowledge. I really know the technical side of skiing. I really know the strategical side of skiing. And when I'm with skiers or skiing coaches, I feel confident around them. But if I'm with a golf coach and I'm with a football coach, then I lack a bit of confidence because we're stepping away from domain-specific knowledge and more into the personal realms, or the realms of how you feel about yourself as a person. I don't know if I've gone off-piste there, Victoria, but does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think that some of the coaches in this study talked about kind of this gold standard of coaching, and reaching that gold standard, and then the openness coming sort of beyond that. So you reach a certain point, and then you're prepared to kind of be a little more open to the other sports. And I think certainly, and also if I look across to my PhD data, I've come across a lot of individuals that kind of are within the sport of rowing are like, I know exactly what I'm doing, this, and this. But then if they go to look outside of that, they automatically go into their shell. And I think it's kind of been really evident there that that confidence and that kind of perceived competence as well from the coaches is really has a massive impact on this boundary work and kind of how much they take from that and how much they can get from that in terms of learning. And I think also the element of competition within sport also kind of really comes into play with, how much a coach will be prepared to share. And actually then when you look at the cross-sport interaction, maybe there's more of a willingness because you're not sharing something to your competitor or within your own kind of context.
Well, that's what I would have thought, is that people would be more inclined to share and more confident to share because, hey, I'm not giving this to anybody who has a direct competition with me or anything like that. So that notion would make a lot of sense to me.
Yeah.
There's another coach in the paper who spoke very differently, and he said, I'm loving being part of this environment because nobody's judging me on my technical competence. And if we think back to that football academy environment, if you work in that every day, then there is a strong sense that in everything you do, in everything you say, in every day, you're being judged and you're being evaluated and you're being given competence, ascribed competence by the rest of that community. So that one of the coaches that we spoke to that I was just mentioning sort of said this was an environment whereby I felt free and liberated because I was no longer the group around me knew nothing about my sport, so they couldn't judge my technical competence, and therefore I was able to come to this with an open heart to explore more of my how I was going to develop my interpersonal skills, how I was going to develop other knowledges that are important to my coaching that aren't about my technical and tactical knowledge, of which, to be honest, I'm pretty skilled. I've got that bit sussed. It's some of the other things that I really needed help with, and this was an environment, these cross sport boundaries that enabled that to happen.
Comes back to that power threat relationship.
There's undoubtedly power relations going on here because, as Etienne would say, I think Etienne and Bev would say, the community, the landscape that you operate in has the power to ascribe competence to you. And the landscape that we all operate in is one we choose to navigate, but that makes judgments around us. And it says to us, this type of person, this type of knowledge is good, or this type of knowledge is desirable, or working for this organization gives you particular esteem and kudos, etc. And those are value power laden judgments essentially about your value and your position in the landscape, and that whole construct then of the landscape is power laden. I think though what the landscape's perspective tries to say is, well, it's always there, but there's quite a lot of other things going on as well.
Victoria, tell me a bit about your second category, sense making. What do you actually mean by that, and what did that look like across the coaches, their ability to sense make?
Yeah, so I think within this program, it kind of looked like how the coaches could translate what they were doing as part of the program into their home coaching environment. So lots of the coaches initially kind of said that the work that they were, or the sessions that they were engaging with on the program, were relatively broad, and they kind of struggled initially to make sense of what they were kind of learning, or what they were engaging with there, in terms of translating that back into their home coaching environment. But when they moved to maybe kind of 6 months on from the session, they then came back and could really see how they could start to relate what they were doing. And a lot of that came from the interaction with others on the program, and starting to sort of go back into their home environment and then come back onto the program, and that kind of backwards and forwards, and effectively boundary crossing. And then coming back and making sense of that back in their own home environment. So a lot of it was about that translation back into their own coaching.
Don, what did you take from the sense making piece here?
Yeah, I think we haven't talked hugely yet about the Ackerman and Backer framework that we drew on for this paper, which was drawn from an educational field and classify different types of boundary interactions, if you like. And we found this really helpful because it was a way of better understanding how people respond when they come up against or they encounter new things. So it might be whether it's a new practice, or it's a new theory, it's a new idea, it's a new policy document, or a new way of working. What do you do with that as a coach, and how do you respond to it? Sometimes we encounter new things and we sort of we turn away and we walk away and say that's not for us. Sometimes we'll come up against new practices that we want to take on board. So we look at them and we wrestle with them, if you like, at the boundary, and we'll work out how we're going to take things away. And the sense-making part of this paper sort of explores different ways in which the coaches did that. Sometimes that was relatively simple. Sometimes it was really complex. So there's one coach in the paper who said that we were introduced to this new theoretical concept, and I didn't get it. And I didn't get it until I came back 6 months later, having done loads of work on it. And then I could wrestle with it and start to apply it. And this, again, helped us to sort of understand that the sort of interactions that the coaches were having weren't simple, clear. They were complicated. They took a great deal of time to navigate sometimes, and were different for each individual. And therefore, the implications, if you like, for the designers of the program and for the people who were responsible for putting this together was actually quite challenging, because you had all of these different interactions with different individuals going on, across the entire program. So it's an immensely complicated, individualized, bespoke process that the leaders of the program were required to broker.
It makes the development of a training course, if that's what we want to call it, probably a horrible term, quite an onerous. It makes it sound quite onerous, Don. It really does. I suppose I'm thinking about any training course I'm trying to develop, and I'm thinking about how I've got to look at the world through my attendees' eyes, my delegates' eyes, the people who I'm delivering to. I've got to think about their complex landscape, essentially, if I'm going to deliver something that's going to be efficacious.
I would use the term joyous rather than onerous, because that's the joy. I think that's the joy of being an educator. And it's saying, actually, do we want to make a difference? How are we going to make a difference here? How are we going to help these people to make a difference? Well, in order to do that, we're not going to give them a prescribed textbook and say, learn this, regurgitate. We're going to say, by understanding your context and understanding, you're trying to understand your landscape and how it's configured and what the power relations are in that landscape, which fundamentally affect whether you might listen to me, whether you might listen to other people, whether you're going to sit in this room with your arms folded saying, I'm not having this, or whether you're actually going to come with an open heart and say, yeah, just give me everything. I'll just suck it up. I'm here to learn. By understanding people's dispositions and by understanding their landscape and then constructing the environment in the way to best try and broker those boundary interactions that they're going to have, that's where you're going to get some sense of value being generated. So yes, it's immensely complicated. Yes, I think it takes a really skilled, hugely skilled practitioner to do that well. But I think that's the joy of being an educator. So that's why I'd say it was joyous.
You should be a sports psychologist, mate. I love the way you've reframed onerous into joyous in one fell swoop.
I think maybe a week ago, when we weren't looking quite so positively about the world and how things were going to open up, I might not have got there. But today, I'm going, no, it's joyous. It's great. Isn't the world wonderful?
So take us through, Victoria. Take us through the third category, which is reflection and mentoring.
Yeah, so I think in the third section, we talk a lot about reflection and kind of how these boundaries and the interactions at them kind of aid that reflection process for the coaches on the program. And we talk about, again, from Ackerman and Bakker, perspective making and perspective taking. So we talk about this in relation to the meaning and the sense that these guys are kind of taking from their interactions, and this constant process of reflection. And for me, kind of across the program and across all sections, these coaches are constantly reflecting on everything that they interact with, and they're constantly taking different value and they're taking different meaning from all of these interactions across their landscape. And I think that's true for hopefully any coach on their kind of journey. And I think this reflection, it always, we come back to it a lot in coaching anyway, but specifically here, it's kind of extending beyond that home environment again. So reflecting on these interactions with others, and reflecting on all these different environments. And then obviously within this program as well, moving to the mentoring, every coach worked with a mentor. So then it's about their reflection as part of that process as well. So as Don's already kind of alluded to, there's so much going on as part of this program, and that mentor is again another person that the coach interacts with, and again is not from their sport. So again, that's crossing that cross-sport boundary again. So there's just so much going on. So reflection became such a big part of the program for every coach, because there was so many boundaries being crossed, and so much going on as part of that process.
Yeah, Don?
I think the mentoring aspect was really interesting, and we emphasised this in this aspect of the paper. And I think this is illustrative of where coach learning has gone over the last 10 years, maybe, as people have started to recognize that we need to move beyond mere communities of practice type thinking, where we're worried about, how well a course goes or whether people enjoy the course and all that kind of thing. Because we recognize that the journey that coaches are on these types of programs are not confined within the program or locally even within their practice. But I think people genuinely have started to recognize, they might not use the term, that coaches operate in a landscape. And there are so many different components to that landscape. If we're going to prepare and help coaches to grow and journey on their landscape most effectively, we've got to help them get outside the bubbles in which perhaps they might operate. And one of the mechanisms that this program used was external mentors to do that. External, they were generally not the same sport, and they were deliberately quite different, really, to the people that they were mentoring. And part of those mentors' job was to try and, one of the coaches said, smash down the barriers, smash down some preconceptions or some just ways of thinking that I had, in order really to open those coaches up to a much broader, deeper and richer experience that actually helped them to grow. And again, that was so much more than, attending a 3-hour workshop on X, Y, or Z. It was about their ongoing learning and development that was so much more profound for them than that. And the mentors, as Victoria says, the mentors were key to brokering, if you like, those boundary interactions.
A final category was reconceptualizing and reframing. Victoria, why don't you take us through your findings here?
Yeah, so I think kind of this section's exciting in terms of it's about kind of the enhancement on the coach's practice. So sort of understanding how has all this that we've talked about transformed? How has it impacted the coach's learning and then their practice? So what have they done and what have they taken from all of these interactions? And kind of lots of the coaches reflected on the journey as a whole, kind of talking about how through the first few months on the program they didn't necessarily know that it would apply back to their coaching. They didn't necessarily know that they'd take a huge amount of value from it. But then kind of saying, well, actually, it's been a massive journey, a huge journey in my coaching and in terms of shaping my identity as an individual. And it was amazing that they reflected on it so positively and so greatly. But in terms of this kind of big, messy picture that they talked us through, it was then like, actually, I'm now going back, perceiving myself as a better coach, having taken a lot of value from the program going forward.
It's fascinating reading some of the accounts in here. The first one, somebody stated, we both went off and completely changed our academies round on the basis of what we experienced. And actually, there's another interesting piece of feedback from another account. Obviously, it was related to a hockey coach who, when he or she presented back at base to his or her fellow coaches, one of them responded by saying, well, what about the hockey? Because obviously they'd spoken a lot about, I don't know whether it was interpersonal and intrapersonal stuff. But obviously, whoever he or she was presenting to thought, there's not enough hockey in here. Where's your domain-specific knowledge? Why didn't you bring stuff back there? Again, just fascinating around sense-making, around, I suppose, a lot of the stuff you've spoken about, both of you, Don. What did you make of this sort of final part, this reconceptualizing and reframing?
It's only a short part of the paper, but actually, in some ways, it's representative of the most exciting bits. And in other work that we're doing in this sphere, using the landscapes framework in different ways, we've deliberately used the term here, reconceptualizing and reframing, because it represents not necessarily the desired outcome, but it represents one of the most fundamental pieces of the puzzle here. That if you can help a learner to radically, hopefully, enhance and change the way that they look at themselves and look at their practice, that you really make a massive difference in the way that they consider themselves as a coach, or the way that they then that's a fantastic thing for an educator and for a designer of the program, essentially, to hear. If somebody comes back to you and said, your this program or this, it changed my life, or it changed the way that I've been thinking about this. And what we've found in looking at a number of different programs is that actually that's not hugely uncommon when things are approached in a really good way. That you've really changed the way I think about how I coach, or you've really changed the way in which I think about success in this environment. And we've found that cross-sport boundary interactions were a really important part of helping people to develop that sense of a reconceptualized and reframed experience. Perhaps that's because, and we need to follow this up a bit more, perhaps that's because people in their own sporting bubble are perhaps in danger of thinking inside the box as opposed to outside it too much. We get consumed with the locality of our practice and what's going on in our immediate, and sometimes it takes external people, cross sport boundary interactions, seeing things from a different perspective, to really shake things up and to change our way of doing things, or to change our way of seeing things. And again, I think that's where this sort of theoretical frame of saying, well, if we can see the learner as being on a journey through their landscape, and actually they're only visiting these communities of practice along the way, of which there are many, then that trajectory that we're trying to help them on, that is a really good way of thinking about how we could open up their minds, lift up their heads, and see the bigger picture that perhaps lies outside of their immediate worlds. And that's really potentially quite exciting, I think, in terms of learning as a journey of becoming, of helping people to understand what really matters to them and what meaning they're making of the experiences that they're going through.
Just something that you said there, Don, strikes me as so important, and I know this is only a small part of the piece here, but the behavioural norms, the learning norms, I suppose the linguistic norms within a specific sport can be so magnetic, can be so enticing to stick to. It's what we know. This is what we know and what we do. So it has a sort of a cultural element to it. If we would define culture as what we know and what we do. Victoria, it seems to me that this line of inquiry is really, really useful because it can broaden minds around exploring learning opportunities across sport. And getting to know these boundaries can be really, really useful to persuade people to go in this direction, essentially.
Yeah, completely. And I think cross sport, but also even beyond that, I think through kind of understanding their journey through this lens, coaches can draw on not only cross sport interactions, but also cross discipline interactions within an even wider landscape. So I've had coaches in some of the work I'm doing now talk about the impact of their family and the impact of previous job roles, previous professions, that have nothing to do with sport, but actually really impact their journey and the meaning they're taking from what they're doing as a coach. And I think yes, absolutely, this lens allows coaches to look cross sport and into the wider world of sport, but also beyond that, into kind of their wider journey as an individual, and the impact that has on their coaching practice as well.
And what I love about this, Don, is that I suppose the reality is, when I reflect upon this, it's not that looking across sports, or as you're saying there, Victor, or looking towards other domains, whether it's other performance domains or whatever it might be, that's existed for quite some time. Perhaps the volume of doing that has turned up quite drastically over the last, 2 decades, as people have become more acquainted with things like marginal gains and doing the 1% and let's go and explore this environment and that environment. It's been happening. But what I love about this work, over the last hour, you've really made me reflect on the efficacy of doing that. How do we do that? We do that, that's fine. But I think over the last 2 decades, I don't know what you think, Don, here. Over the last 2 decades, we've said we'll go and do that, but have we done that effectively? Have we done that efficaciously? Do we really know how to deliver, whether it's across sport education programs or just existing in a world where we go across sports and across domains and we start to investigate things? How can we do that effectively? What does that mean for the learner? How can the learner, what considerations has the learner got? Some rambles there for you, Don, but I don't know if you've got any reflections at the end there.
Yeah, huge. I think you're right. This kind of cross environment experience has been going on for years. We're not suggesting by any means this is new. Of course it isn't.
Yeah.
For years people have been going, let's go and see what the Cirque du Soleil do in sport, because that's amazing. We'll go and learn from that. Or let's go and see, one of the big professional franchises in the USA and learn from what they're doing. And great. Not belittling that at all. I think what this framework has helped us to do, and one of the frameworks that sort of comes with this is something called the value creation framework, which is really written about in the 4th book that we haven't got to quite yet. We haven't talked about that. But what this helps us to do is to better understand how people not only make sense of this, but make sense of boundary interactions and new things that they learn, but how do they apply it? What difference does that make? And how do we start to evidence that? Because I think there are very, very few. If you could look across all of the research that's ever been done in coach education, very, very little of it has actually considered, well, does this make a difference to coaches' practice? Or even more challenging, does this make a difference to the coaches' athletes' practice? Does it actually make them better at what they do? And part of what we're trying to sort of pick up here is to say we need to tackle that issue, and we can't do it in a cause and effect type way. The world is too complex for that. But by using things like the value creation framework through this perspective of landscapes of practice, we're hopefully going to generate a better sense of how people make sense of the different experiences that they have, and how they then seek to apply the things that they make to their practice and what difference it makes. And I think that gives us real confidence that there's something of value here that hasn't really been tackled hugely well yet. But we're just at the beginnings of that journey, really.
I completely agree. Brilliant. Guys, this has been really fascinating, and it's not a subject I've found it easy to grasp at the beginning, but it makes sense to me now, and I think it's really, really interesting. And with that 4th book, I suppose we're going to have you both on again and talking more about the dynamic developments of social learning theory and the approaches you guys are taking here. Really fascinating stuff. And I know you will have tapped the interest of the Sports Psych Show audience. How can people get in contact? Are you on social media? Can they follow you on social media? Victoria, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at Huckle, and would be more than happy to chat to anyone. Yeah.
Perfect. And Don?
You can find me on LinkedIn or on Twitter at Donald Vinson. You could also just Google search my name, Don Vinson, University of Worcester, and that will take you through to my university webpage, which has all of my contact details there.
Brilliant. Well, look, Victoria and Don, that has just been a fantastic conversation. I've learned so much. So thank you both for your time today.
Dan, thanks for the opportunity to chat. Always good to meet someone new. Thank you for that. And thank you for the opportunity to share some of our work. It's been fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been really great to chat and to talk through things with a new face. Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Everyone, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.